When I first started teaching, I was terrified to do overnight trips, and for good reason. I mean, why would anyone want to take bus loads of kids someplace overnight? That's a lot of responsibility. A lot can go wrong, but it's very good for recruitment and retention in your program, and it gives students some experiences that they would have never gotten otherwise. So I believe in them, but they're a lot of work. So in this video, I'm going to try to go into some detail on what I do to set up an overnight trip, and maybe you might consider trying one or maybe tweaking the way you do stuff, or if you do something different and you think it's better, drop a comment in the comment section below, and we'd love to learn from you too. The purpose of this isn't necessarily to plan the trip out, but to talk about how to set up a trip with your parents, with the school district, and that kind of thing. So make sure to read your local policies, FM local or whatever that you've got with your school district policy to make sure that you're doing everything correctly. Some of them like to have bids and stuff where you bid out everything, and how you spend a sizable amount of money and all that kind of stuff is important. So definitely review that policy and make sure you're doing everything by the book, or else it can cause a lot of problems if you don't. The school districts that I've taught in, their overnight travel and even their out-of-state travel guidelines are fairly limited. It's usually just a small paragraph about how often you can do it and how to get it approved through sometimes the school board or the superintendent or whatever. Sometimes I've had to go to school board meetings and present, hey, we're going on a trip and this is what we're going to do. And that can be a little nerve-wracking, but just make sure you've got a good plan, you've got a sample itinerary, and you kind of want to show them that you've got everything planned out and you know what's going on, whether it's not just some half-hatched idea. It's like, hey, yeah, I just thought we'd go one weekend, and just kind of hang out in Florida, wherever you're going. They're not going to like that. So make sure you have a good detail of your trip. And whether you're talking to your school board or your administration or the parents, you want to have a good why. Why are we going on the trip? And for our trips, I like to have some kind of centerpiece. And for me, it's got to be educational based and preferably performance based. So is there a cool performance venue that we can go and play at? Is there a cool festival someplace? Submit concert recordings around and see if we can get invited to play somewhere, and then maybe you get to hang out with other music students that are really focused and engaged in music too. Those are the things that I like to do. If you're just going to go on vacation, they can do that with their families and friends, and they can probably do it a lot cheaper too, because group travel can be pretty pricey. So once I've got my why laid out and I've got sort of my travel plans and kind of starting to price things and put things into place, well, it's time for a pre-trip meeting. You want to get the students and parents together in a room and say, hey, I'm thinking about going on a trip. I want to see what you guys think about this. You let them know how much it's going to cost, let them know what they're going to do there, let them know the expectations, and get some feedback and say, hey, does this sound like something that we're going to do? We're going to have to fundraise. We're going to have to do this and that. I'm going to need some parents to help chaperone. Are we willing to do this? And get feedback. And if they're on board and they understand your expectations, well, then you can start with the next phases of the trip. And one of those should be having a trip contract. So once you start getting the price of the trip, you know how much it's going to cost. You get the contract together. And the contract has to be two sides. What are you doing for them, and what are they supposed to be doing for you? So in the top portion of it, I got a sample contract right here. In the top portion of it, I have laid out all the stuff that they're going to do on the trip, whether it's going to include transportation, different accommodations, are meals included, are they not included, do they need to take money for meals? What sort of activities are they going to do? Is there admission into any museums or whatever you're doing there? Are there contest fees or festival fees if you're going to a contest or festival? Are there recording fees that they're going to have to help cover? Just so lay out everything that they're going to do there, more or less. What are they getting out of the trip? And then in the next half of the contract, you need to say, hey, what are you going to need to do to go on this trip? What's your side of the contract? Is there a financial obligation? Like, hey, we need to raise this much money. Is there a payment schedule? What happens if they don't pay on time? Is there going to be a late fee? What happens if they never pay? Is there a deadline for how late they can pay, or are you going to accept payments indefinitely? Your student's going to be in their 30s before they decide to start making payments. So you might want to have that detailed here. It's like, hey, we need money and it's due by this date. If it's past this date, then, contract is broken and, you don't get your money back. Or you do get your money back, whatever your refund policy is. You also want to have your expectations here for who can go, who's eligible to go on the trip. Is everybody eligible to go on the trip? Do you need to be an orchestra to go on the trip? Can anybody in the school go on the trip? What is the eligibility process for this? What happens if they're eligible to go on the trip, and then between the time that they've signed the contract and the time that you go on the trip, what if that criteria changes and they're no longer eligible to go on the trip? Do they still need to go? Do they get a refund? What happens? Something that'll save you a ton of time is when you're going over the payment process and they're going to be cutting a check, put down who they write the check to. Who do they make the check out to? That's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headache, because if they make out the wrong person, you might have to have them reissue or whatever, and that's going to be a pain. What happens if the trip gets canceled? What if the school district cancels your trip? What if there's some sort of national emergency or civil unrest or pandemic or whatever, war, and your trip gets canceled? What happens? Do they get a refund? Definitely recommend to everybody in your group that they get traveler's insurance. You might want to get traveler's insurance too. That way, if something does happen, they can be reimbursed through their traveler's insurance. On the next page of the contract, I have my behavior expectations. What is the student expected to do when they're on the trip? Do they need to be on time? What's their attire supposed to be like? What sort of language should they be using? How should they act and treat each other? How should they act and treat, servers at restaurants and the hotel staff? And what should they be doing in the hotel when they're there? And where, should they be able to leave their rooms at all times of the night or whatever? So make sure to put those expectations in there. Every single thing that you can think of, put it in there. My list sort of gets updated over time because, the more you teach, the more you run into some strange things. So, the list starts to get longer. But definitely, like if you want to have a drugs and alcohol policy, if you want them to be able to vape on the trip or whatever, it's like, well, they're 18 and they're off campus. Are they allowed to vape? That needs to be covered here. Don't assume that they know everything. It's got to be in the fine print. So if a student isn't able to meet these behavioral expectations before you go on the trip, do you think that they're going to be able to meet these expectations while they're on the trip? Generally not. So you might want to have something in there that says like, hey, if you're a problem, if you can't control yourself, if you can't control your behavior, you're going to be disinvited from the trip and you're not getting a refund. Or you are getting a refund. Whatever your refund policy is, make sure it's in here too. I usually have something here at the bottom, like if the school administration has been taking administrative action against a student because of their behavior, if they're getting suspended from school or they're getting sent to alternative campus or something like that, that's a deal breaker for me. I'm not going to let them go on the trip. So, you might want to have something like that in your behavior contract too, and definitely enforce it. Sometime before you go on the trip, a week or two out, it's a good idea to have another trip meeting and make it mandatory. If you don't come to this meeting, you don't get to go on the trip. So students and parents got to show up to this meeting. We're going to go over everything. At this time, you're going to pass out the itinerary to all of them. You're going to walk through the trip. Okay, this is where we're going. This is what we're going to do. This is what the expectations are in all these places. Try to provide as much detail as possible. Don't leave anything out. I like to give my students a checklist. Hey, this is what you need to pack. This is what you need to have with you, and have extra copies of the itinerary and even post the itinerary online. That way, if they lose their itinerary or something, hey, just go to the website, get the itinerary, read it on your phone. It's also a really good idea to have an emergency number. Hey, if something happens, if you have a family emergency, you need to get a hold of somebody, call this number. Whether it's your personal cell phone number, I hesitate to give that out. Either get a burner phone or, like a Google number, or have, an administrator have their number, something like that, so that they can get in contact with somebody so that they can take care of their needs if something comes up. I'm a big believer in small groups. Take the total number of staff that you have on the trip and maybe leave one person out of that mix so that they can kind of be a gopher and go do other things so they're not necessarily tied down to a group. Maybe that might be your school administrator, or maybe that's you, but take your parent volunteers that are there helping you, your chaperones, your staff, whoever's on the trip with you, and divide up the number of students and put them into groups. I like to divide them up by hotel rooms and try to make sure that every student that's in that group is on the same bus together in the same hotel room together. It just makes it easier for things like room checks and attendance checks before you leave a location, so you don't leave any students behind. I recommend that you don't just count heads and be like, all right, yep, that's 50 or whatever, and pull out, because what if somebody else got on your bus? That might not be a good thing. You might also want to set up a communication system. I like to use GroupMe. At the time of this current year, GroupMe works pretty well. You can see who's read and who hasn't read, and you can send pictures if you need to check in on students and say, hey, where's everybody? Make sure you're with your group. Take a photo of all 4 of you or 8 of you or however big your group sizes are. I always tell this story to my students, and you're welcome to tell it to your students too. If you tell it in the first person, it sounds more relatable and more believable. So go ahead and steal this story. I don't care. I'm not gonna come find you. But anyway, one time I was judging in a contest, and they put me up in a hotel. It was a pretty nice hotel, and got checked into my room. Went to bed on time, getting ready for the next day. At about 1 a.m. Let's just say 1 a.m. Just started to hear a lot of noise in the hallways. Started to hear just a lot of banging around, a lot of this stuff, and it just kind of continued, and this just kept going on and on and on, and I started hearing stuff outside the hotel room, and I looked out my window, and we had these like little balconies outside, and I saw students like jumping from balcony to balcony, and all this stuff, and so I just went out in my hallway, and I approached the student and said, hey, what's going on here? They're like, oh yeah, we're here on a trip or whatever. It's like, all right, who's your director? Who's your sponsor, director, coach, whatever? Oh, I don't know. So I just kept talking to people. It's like until I found who was in charge of this thing, and knocked on their hotel room door. It's like, hey, you need to get a hold of this situation. There's other guests in this hotel. We got to sleep. I got to be able to work tomorrow. So, oh, sorry, we'll get this shut down, and eventually got it under control, but not a good situation. Well, the next day I was in the sight reading room, right? And guess what? That afternoon, those students and that teacher came into the sight reading room, and they looked at me, and I looked at them, and the orchestra teacher was just like, no, this is not going to go well. So be careful, because that could happen to you too. So when you're in the hotel, set the expectations for the students. Keep the noise level down, specifically in the later hours. Let other people sleep. What if there's somebody in the room next door to you, and they're making $1 million deal the next day? They got to be able to get that sleep so they can concentrate. What if you've got a government official over here and they've got an important meeting? If they're tired and cranky the next day, that could start a war, right? There's all sorts of important people staying in these hotels. Make sure you respect them. It's not just about you and your trip. It's about the whole world, and we need to live in it respectfully and courteously together. I like to do room checks in the hotel. I want to make sure that they're staying in the room, and I put strict enforcement of that. If they leave the room after curfew, I send them home. So what I do is I go to the rooms or whatever. Parents can do room checks too. Other staff can do room checks. Go to the room, make sure everybody in the room is there that's supposed to be there, and make sure that people who aren't supposed to be in the room are not there. And say, hey, everybody's here. Okay, count them, make sure they're there, make sure you can actually see them, and say, hey, okay, I'm taping you guys into your room. So, close the door, just put a piece of Scotch tape, probably up high where the housekeeping staff doesn't see it, or else sometimes they can come through and they're like, hey, there's tape all over these doors, and rip it all off, and then that's a big problem. So put it up high, out of the way, where nobody can see it. And if they open the door, it breaks the seal on the tape, and then they've left their room. So it doesn't, the tape can't stop the students from leaving the room, but once they open the door, how are they going to make that seal again? So you know if they've left the room, and then everybody in the room gets sent home, or whatever your behavioral expectations and consequences are going to be. You can do that. So, yep, it's old-fashioned, but the tape on the door thing has worked out pretty well for me over the years. I've never had a case where a student has left the room at night, and if they have, I didn't know about it. So, sometimes our students are smarter than us. The last night of your trip is your greatest risk. Okay, if it's a 4-day trip, you're there on the third night, and that's when the students are going to misbehave, because if they get sent home, well, we're going home anyway. So that's when you got to be on your highest alert. Sometimes you might want to hire private security on that night, or maybe the whole time, depending on how your group's doing, and just have them stay on the floor of the hotel that your students are staying on, or have them check the hotel lobby or whatever. It's like, hey, if you see students running around, give me a call, or try to stop them or whatever, and that way you can keep things under control. Another thing you can do to make that last night easier is make sure that there's lots of activities on the trip, keep them busy, and have limited amounts of downtime. If they're really tired, if they're exhausted, you want them to sleep, and you want them to sleep on the bus ride home too. So wear them out, get them tired, make sure it's an eventful trip. I could probably do a whole season on trips. There's a lot that goes on a trip, and I'll probably do some more episodes on this, maybe even document a trip that I do one day. But these are the basics of an overnight trip. If I left something out, or if you've got some sage advice that you want to leave in the comments section below, go ahead and leave it below so we can all learn from you. I've had fun making this episode. I hope that in this season especially, that these little videos, you can glean some stuff from them, maybe take some stuff, leave some stuff. And overall is that I hope that it makes your life as an orchestra director easier. So we'll see you in episode 3.